You've seen the screams, the traps, the twists, but do you know the stories behind them? The little details that make you go,
this is the most fuckery thing I've ever seen.
Or,
yeah, I saw my own leg off, but shitty toilet, I'm out.
I'm Grace from Red Rum True Crime, and I'm joined by Stu from British Murders with Stuart Blues. We've been horror fans since we were kids, and we are total Saw geeks. This franchise is iconic for a reason, and we cannot wait to talk every crazy twist, every insane trap, and all the behind-the-scenes tidbits you probably didn't notice. This first season is 10 episodes, breaking down, analysing, and dissecting every single one of the Saw films. And the final cut doesn't stop there. Every season, I'll pick a different horror franchise with a new guest co-host to geek out over, dissect, and celebrate everything that makes these films unforgettable. We talk traps, legacy, and philosophy. I'm Grace, and this is The Final Cut. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome back to Seeing Red. This is the season 14 premiere, and guess who's back?
It's me. I'm back. Hello, everybody. It's only just bloody Bethan. Hello. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again for season 14. It's our 8th year doing the show, and we're back for a number 14 season, which is very exciting. So hello and thank you to everybody who continues to tune in week after week and join us for our little show. Love it.
I genuinely feel a bit nervous. I don't know, because we've been doing Crime Wave, haven't we, for the past month or so? So we have been recording together, but I don't know, I just feel like it's such a momentous occasion. Maybe because it's coincided with the premiere of a new season, I don't know.
Possibly. I will make the promise that I won't go away for 3 months again and leave you, Mark, because it is a lot. So thank you. A huge thank you, Mark, because you've covered me to go and have a little bit of a break having Oliver, and it has been really, really helpful. So that's amazing. But also, I don't underestimate how much effort and work it has been for you. So thank you.
Thank you. That's kind.
Now, let's get back to being mean to each other.
Let's get back to being mean. I do just want to thank our listeners, though, for sticking with us as well through any changes or any sort of disruption. I know I took a week off unexpectedly a few weeks ago.
You did what?
I know.
You did what?
But we are back now, and really excited to enter a new season back together.
Yes. And I really hope that all of our listeners enjoyed the episodes that we pre-recorded, because where we'd pre-recorded my written scripts, you know, maybe a month or two before they then were released, I'd almost forgotten some of the cases that we'd covered in the discussions we had. So I really enjoyed seeing them get released, seeing the descriptions come out on social media, and then actually the conversations people were having. It was quite fun. I quite enjoyed watching that unfold. So I hope you guys enjoyed those episodes. So without further ado, let's get cracking. In today's digital age, we receive our news instantly, fed directly to our smart devices with a few taps of a screen. However, before technology took over, newspapers were the primary source of information, bringing the world's events to our doorsteps, printed on thin paper in smudgy black and white ink. And many older listeners will remember a time when the news wasn't just something we scrolled through, but something that arrived by hand, often delivered by a paperboy. Sometimes you'd have to pop to the shops to get things. And I know when we talked about Princess Diana's death, we talked about how the time it happened made a big difference, because some of the papers had already run with their front page stories. And then, you know, the news was as it happened, as quickly as they could print it, but not as immediate as now. Nowadays, something happens and within 10 minutes, we all could know about that if we are on our phone. It's really mad to think, isn't it?
It's so different. I used to buy a newspaper and had bought a newspaper since I was probably 13 years old because I was that sad. And now there's no point, because by the time you get a newspaper, it's yesterday's news. Literally, of course it is. And yeah, you're right about Princess Diana. I remember vividly seeing the headlines on that Sunday morning, Princess Diana seriously injured in car crash. And of course, we all knew at that point that she was dead. So it was really interesting to see those headlines. And yeah, you still obviously have printed papers, but we know everything now as soon as it happens. You're absolutely right.
And the paperboy, the idea of a paperboy, I'm sure they must still have jobs, but, you know, these young teenagers putting a bag over their shoulder, going door to door, newspapers going through the letterbox on this allocated route. For decades, that was how newsagents kept entire communities informed, one household at a time. And I don't know whether it still happens today, but it was that kind of job. It was that first job for a lot of people. It gave the young people kind of a sense of independence, you know, a bit of extra money that they might not normally get from pocket money. You know, also quite often a chance to just get that freedom and that independence of you go out on your own to do that. You're maybe riding a bike or walking. You are responsible for that. And then also, you know, getting to know the people in those streets that would see you and say hi and that sort of thing. And it was actually one of the first jobs I had as a teenager, and I quite enjoyed it, I will be honest. Did you have a paper run, Mark?
No, I always felt that was beneath me.
Of course you did. I knew this when I asked the question.
I just, didn't you have to get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning before school? That was never going to happen.
So all of the good paper runs were taken already. So I had a Sunday once a week. Honestly, no money really in it. And once a week on a Sunday, I'd go and deliver the Sunday. Really massive, heavy ones because they had all the supplements as well.
Not
but
for me.
I didn't get the weekly, daily ones. No. I had what I would imagine you would probably look down on jobs at first. So I worked with my dad's friend on a market stall. He sold vacuum repair parts.
Oh, I think that's cool.
That was one of my first jobs.
I'd have enjoyed that.
It was pretty decent.
Yeah.
And then I worked at McDonald's, which I will always say was an amazing job, but I feel like you'd probably look down on me for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And a paper run until I then worked in more like retail-y sort of things.
I mean, I say all this, but my Saturday job, and again, my dad he'd come home from the pub and say, I've got you a job, you start next Saturday. And I was like, I don't want a job, or I don't want that job. And it's like tough. And my first job, and I think I did it for about 10 months, every Saturday at a car sales garage, washing all of the cars. There were about 60 cars. And I would just work non-stop.
That's a proper job. Wow.
Maybe, yeah. I'd do 6 hours on a Saturday.
Nice.
It was 25 quid, and I was about 14, 15. And I built up
back
real
in the
good
50s,
muscles.
Like that was a lot of money, wasn't it, back in the 50s?
You. How dare you, the 90s.
So we are slightly heading probably towards a direction of where you're from as well, because we're going to be heading to Stourbridge. So it's a small market town not far from Birmingham in the West Midlands. And back in 1978, 13-year-old Carl Bridgewater was the local paperboy in Stourbridge. Carl had been doing his paper round for a while, and he was really good at it. He was reliable, he was polite, he was professional, he never cut corners, and the people of Stourbridge knew him well, not just as the boy who delivered their morning headlines, but also a familiar and friendly presence on their doorsteps. And he had good old-fashioned manners, so the older residents really appreciated that. He'd always greet them with a cheerful good morning or a respectful nod, and he went about his route. And to the elderly, he was also a welcome visitor. He'd often stop for a brief chat if time allowed. To busy parents, he was a dependable part of the daily routine. And he never just dumped papers at the end of a driveway or stuffed them through the letterbox carelessly. Instead, he made sure he posted them properly, tucked them inside, kept them safe from the wind or rain. And even if it was really cold and drizzly morning or horrible, he didn't cut corners. He never grumbled. He never failed to show up. And considering this is a 13-year-old lad we're talking about, I don't think that can be understated, can it?
No, however, I think in the late 70s, there was more focus and emphasis on reputation within a family, and that would have been instilled in him, I'm sure, from, I don't know if he had a mum and a dad, one or both or none, but from his parental guardian, whoever that may have been. So I'm not surprised, actually, because he would have been known within that community and his behaviour would have been a reflection of his family's behaviour. And that was a big deal back then, way more than it is now.
Yeah, he did. He had a mum and a dad, and I do agree with you. I do think that is the time when this is set, 1978. I do agree. I think children and young people were different, and I think a 13-year-old then was a lot more of an adult, almost nearly an adult, whereas now you might think that they're still much more like a child. So perhaps nowadays this would be a 17-year-old rather than a 13-year-old. But yeah, I do know what you mean. And Tuesday, September the 19th in 1978 should have been like any other afternoon. Carl had set off as usual, weaving through the suburban streets of Stourbridge, methodically working through his route. And it was a routine so ordinary and so uneventful that no one, not even Carl, thought about it. He just kind of was on autopilot doing what he knew and what he was good at. Amongst the stops on Carl's paper round that day was Yew Tree Farm, a remote property on the outskirts of town, set back from the road at the end of a long, uneven track. The farmhouse was an old and weathered brickwork structure that had stood there for generations, and it was owned by two elderly cousins, Mary Poole and Fred Jones, who both lived there quietly, tending to their land and mostly keeping quite a low profile. However, on that particular afternoon, neither of them were home. Yew Tree Farm was empty, except for whoever was inside when Carl arrived, and nobody can say for sure what exactly happened when young Carl slipped through the gate and entered the property with the innocent intention of just delivering a newspaper. Nobody saw him go in. But all we know is that this would be Carl's final delivery. He never left that property. Some hours later, it was Dr. Angus MacDonald, a local physician and family friend of the farm's owners, who would make a ghastly discovery. He'd been asked to check on the property while Fred and Mary were away, and so he made his way up the track to the farmhouse, only to find the front door ajar, and what he saw inside would haunt him forever. Carl's small body lay on the floor of the living room, still in his school uniform. Nearby, a newspaper was discarded as though he had been interrupted mid-delivery. There were no signs of a struggle, just a single fatal shotgun blast to the head. An appalling crime that was so cruel and so merciless that it felt more like an execution than an accident. The police raced to the scene, where Carl was quickly pronounced dead, and Yew Tree Farm was cordoned off as a crime scene.
When you said that there, that this was more like an execution, before you even said it, that's exactly what I was thinking, that this single blast to the head, and it's just so weird to think that that's a 13-year-old boy that is the victim of that, and it does sound so cold and execution-like in style that that's so rare. And I'm not saying it was an execution, but it sounds like it, and it's just weird for a child to be at the end of that. We're so used to, when we cover that kind of murder, it's one adult to another, isn't it? It's so rarely an adult to a child, because that's so cold-blooded.
And he was so small. You think of the size of the body on the floor, and how little he would have been, and it would be a horrible sight to see if this was an adult, but even more the worse because this is a child. Elsewhere, when Carl failed to return home at his usual time, his father, Brian Bridgewater, became concerned, and so he and Carl's sister Jane set out to look for Carl. They attempted to retrace his delivery route, and upon reaching Yew Tree Farm, they noticed police activity, but they weren't immediately informed of the situation. It was later that evening, when uniformed police officers knocked on their door, that they were informed of the horrible truth. Carl had been brutally murdered. The residents of Stourbridge received the news with equal amounts of shock, sadness, and anxiety. Many believed that their once quiet and safe little town would never be the same again. It was a place where people once felt safe in their routines, and doors were left unlocked, and where children roamed freely, and it was now a place gripped by fear and disbelief. And we've talked about this so many times, haven't we? Especially in this sort of era, in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, where people did leave their doors unlocked, and people did allow their children to just go in the morning and expect them back for tea. And then suddenly something happens, and everybody is just plunged into this sense of nothing's normal ever again.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've said it a million times before, but it did feel like a safer place back then, the whole world, not just this country, I would say globally. It just felt things generally in the Western world were safer then than they are now. So this is even more shocking for a community to experience because, yeah, nothing like that would have happened before, probably, in anyone's lives there.
But what I would also say is, going back to our discussion at the beginning of the show, some things will have happened, but you may not have known about them because you didn't have the news from 4 towns over or from up in Scotland, far away. Now, the second something happens in America, I can have that information at my fingertips. So whilst I do agree with you, and I do think it was a safer time, it also wasn't fully safe, but people just did not realise what was going on in other places. So yes, your little town was safe, but you didn't know that the same sort of things had maybe happened somewhere else as well. And in an instant, the sense of security that had defined that community was absolutely shattered. Parents who would always wave their children off to play without a second thought now kept them closer, and their minds were racing with terrifying possibilities. Neighbours who once exchanged friendly nods and casual conversations at their garden gates now eyed each other with unease, wondering if an evil child killer was amongst them. And speculation about who was responsible was rife, as locals struggled to comprehend how such a horrific act could have happened in their town. People clung to the hope that the police would swiftly catch whoever had done this, that the nightmare would soon be over. But as the days passed and no arrests were made, the fear deepened. This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. World Mental Health Day takes place on the 10th of October, and this year BetterHelp is shining the spotlight on therapists, people who truly make the world a better place. The right therapist can change everything, and BetterHelp has over 12 years of experience in matching people to the right therapist. BetterHelp therapists work according to a strict code of conduct. They are fully qualified in the UK, and yes, they do match you with a therapist and would identify the right therapist for you, but if you're not happy with that match, you can also switch to a different therapist at any time. And with over 30,000 therapists worldwide, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. And it works with an average rating of 4.9 out of 5 for a live session based on 1.7 million client reviews. So this World Mental Health Day, we are celebrating the therapists who've helped millions of people take a step forward. And if you're ready to find the right therapist for you, BetterHelp can help you start that journey. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/red. That's betterhelp.com/red. The randomness of the crime made it all the more terrifying. This wasn't a pub brawl gone wrong or a domestic dispute. This was the calculated execution of a child. And to the residents of Stourbridge, it was hard to think of anything more grotesque. Rumours spread like wildfire. Some were certain it had been a gang of outsiders, dangerous men passing through, whilst others feared that the murderer was someone more local. But no matter what they believed, one chilling, unanswered question loomed like a dark cloud over Stourbridge, lingering in every home and hanging in the air during every conversation. Who could have done this, and why? Carl Bridgewater was born on January 2nd, 1965 in Wordsley, a suburb of Stourbridge in the West Midlands in England, and he was the eldest son of Brian and Janet Bridgewater, with a sister Jane and a younger brother Philip. The family resided in a modern home on Ascot Gardens, reflecting a comfortable and close-knit household. And from an early age, Carl exhibited a zest for life that endeared him to all who knew him. His enthusiasm and passions extended to various interests. He was a patrol leader in the Scouts, where he embraced his natural leadership skills and the camaraderie and togetherness of scouting activities. Fishing was another passion of his, providing him with serene moments by the water's edge, a contrast to his otherwise active lifestyle. And football also played a significant role in Carl's life. Whilst he didn't represent his school team, he relished casual matches in the park with his friends. That typical boyish love for the game was quite evident here. But also his commitment to responsibility. His strong work ethic, those were really evident as well. After months on a waiting list, he secured a paper round position. And that role not only provided him with pocket money, but also instilled a sense of duty and routine. Every evening, Carl would diligently deliver around 24 newspapers, ensuring timely and accurate service to his community. And Carl was, by all accounts, a unique individual. He was wise, he was reliable, he was polite, and residents along his route spoke highly of his courteous interactions and consistent punctuality. He was known, like I said before, he never cut corners. He had this really good work ethic. And his personable nature made him a really beloved figure. And so when his mutilated body was discovered in Yew Tree Farm on Tuesday, September the 19th, 1978, the local community were floored, and all eyes were suddenly on the local police force to solve this horrible crime and bring the perpetrator to justice. The police response to the killing was swift and urgent. The murder of a child, particularly one as well-loved as Carl, demanded immediate action. Detectives descended on Yew Tree Farm and combed through every inch of the property for clues. And it was clear from the start that this was no accident. It was a single shotgun blast to the head at close range. This wasn't Carl hadn't accidentally been playing with a gun or anything like that. This was an execution. It wasn't a random act of violence as well. He hadn't walked through some hunters that were out poaching or anything like this. This was deliberate. But why?
Because there is a scenario, isn't there? You could see it if it was a different style of gun, if it was a pistol, for example, legitimately owned perhaps on Yew Tree Farm, and Carl had entered the house to put the paper in, which might have been the normal sort of routine, and then seen that as a 13-year-old. You could understand a child picking a gun up and doing something stupid with it and having an accident. But when it's a shotgun, it's and that kind of wound, it's very clear, isn't it, from the outset that somebody has done this. And you're right, it's just like, why a 13-year-old boy and why on those premises? I know the name, but I don't know this case. My immediate go-to on this is that someone was burgling. Someone was robbing the house.
Burglarizing? We've had this so much, haven't we? I can never say it
burglaring.
Robbing. Robbing the house.
Robbing the fucking house. And he was there and he disturbed them and they just reacted in the way they did. But, we'll find out, I'm hoping.
Yeah, well, this is definitely one of the main theories. You're absolutely right that he'd walked in on a burglary at Yew Tree Farm. The elderly owners were away. People had been asked to check in on the property, so it perhaps wasn't a secret that they were away. It's an isolated farmhouse. It's quiet. There's valuable antiques there. However, detectives were kind of thinking, well, maybe this was, not saying it's okay to break in, but a routine break-in, a routine robbery that they would then be investigating when the owners come home. Carl's arrived, delivered his newspaper, like you said, maybe stepped inside because the door was open. Maybe he knew that they would be away and he wanted to pop the newspaper down somewhere, not just on the doormat, so they didn't trip over it. Who knows? For whatever reason, he's gone in and then the intruders just panicked. Maybe they wanted to shut him up. Maybe they just panicked and just raised the shotgun and shot at whoever was coming in. So the police were kind of dealing with this as their main theory. They found some items that were gathered near the door. So it was almost as if the burglar had been getting things and bringing them to the front door ready to steal and then interrupted. Objects had been scattered on the ground outside as well. So a kettle, a basin, some antique teapots. And also Carl's bicycle, quite strangely, had been thrown over a wall into a pigsty. So this crime scene showed clear signs of a sudden and hurried departure. So it was this idea that the murder was a knee-jerk reaction to Carl turning up, rather than a planned ambush and killing of him.
Can I also just say at this point, and I know this probably isn't appropriate to say, but I'm going to have to say it.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely.
I'm sorry, but I have to. So 1978, two elderly cousins, one male, one female, living together at this farm.
Right, I'm going to just stop you there. No.
Come on, Bethan.
No. They are just elderly cousins, companions, living in the house. No, I don't buy this. Okay? I'm not having any of that. We're not having that. We all know what you're trying to insinuate.
Well, it was obviously an incestuous relationship. And I know that's not a nice thing for me to say. And I know I had to say it because maybe other people are thinking that too.
Let's move swiftly on because their relationship is not what we're discussing right now, Mark. And I don't think they were. I think they were just cousins. I think it was that time where you would live with somebody in your family. Often you'd have a brother and sister that would live together. They're not doing each other. They're just living in the same house.
Okay.
Oh, God.
Let's just move on.
Welcome back to season 14, everybody. Now, other aspects of the scene were a bit more disturbing as well. So Carl hadn't been shot in the middle of a struggle or whilst running away. he had been executed. It was a single shotgun blast to the head, and it was at point blank range. That kind of precision was not the work of someone acting out of blind panic, and it did hint at something a little bit more deliberate. So had he startled the intruder, or had he seen something he shouldn't have seen? Was this actually a panicked firing of the gun, or was it a deliberate attempt to take care of a witness? And the brutality of the act did suggest the latter, but the police were left with more questions than answers. And as they began piecing together the events of that day, one thing really did become clear. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of one of the most controversial and troubling murder investigations in British history at the time. So back in 1978, criminal investigation methodology was far less developed and sophisticated than it is today. Forensic science was still in its infancy. Detectives had to follow their own instincts rather than having that irrefutable evidence that we nowadays would see, DNA, fingerprinting and CCTV, that we can really prove that somebody was somewhere.
It's so different now.
Isn't it?
You cannot underestimate that with all of those things that you just mentioned. Back in the 70s, back in the 80s and prior to that, you had to go on gut instincts and lots of informants and relationships that blurred the lines between officers and criminals to really get their ear to the ground to know what was happening. And a real, I don't know what kind of brain, but creative mind almost to try and work out what had happened from the clues that were there. More
policing than data collecting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and analysing
more instincts
of data.
And So detectives began examining known criminals in the area, so people who had a history of burglary, robbery and violent crime, and they really did believe that this perpetrator was no amateur. They didn't think it was a desperate thief on their first outing and they panicked. They thought this was somebody who had history, and they kind of were looking at local offenders who'd recently committed similar crimes as well. And it wasn't long before they identified 4 men who seemed to fit the profile of those capable of such an act. And so the police were aware of this gang of criminals operating in the West Midlands who'd been carrying out a string of violent armed robberies. They were reckless, they were aggressive, they were increasing in danger as well. So they'd escalated from break-ins to full-scale home invasions. So these were Patrick Molloy, James Robinson, and Michael and Vincent Hickey. Those were cousins, Michael Hickey and Vincent Hickey. And they were no strangers to the law. They'd been in and out of trouble for years, but 2 very brazen robberies put them directly in the crosshairs of the police in that investigation into Carl's murder. So on the 24th of November, so just 2 months after Carl's murder, 3 of the men carried out a violent armed robbery at a Tesco supermarket in Birmingham. So James Robinson and Michael Hickey had stormed into the store and they'd made straight for the safe. And then a third unidentified man brandished a shotgun and terrorised customers. And the store manager had attempted to intervene, but they shot a warning shot over his head. It was a real escalation in their criminal behaviour and also proved that they were willing to take and use firearms, and in particular a shotgun, to get what they wanted. And then less than a week later, on the 30th of November, they struck again, and this target was a farmhouse where an elderly couple lived alone. So Robinson and Hickey had forced their way into the farmhouse wearing balaclavas, brandishing a shotgun, barking demands for money, and Hickey remained outside in the car. Robinson took the lead and actually pistol whipped one of the victims in a show of intimidation. So they had only made off with £200, but it was really clear that their willingness to resort to violence was growing. And so to the police, the similarities were striking. They weren't just burglars, they were home invaders, they were armed, they were willing to use force. And some of their targets were isolated properties, much like Yew Tree Farm. They displayed brazen aggression that suggested a lack of remorse. So the detectives began looking at that group a lot more closely. Quite quickly, they began to believe that these were the men responsible. And so the arrests came swiftly. Once police linked the group to the robberies, they brought them in for questioning, not just for the crimes that they were aware of, but also Carl's murder. So, as mentioned earlier, policing in 1978 was very different to today. Back then, police had real power, and also they were a lot more brutal. And I do feel like this is not necessarily a good thing, because, as we said before, we're now more aware of what's going on, and we've got kind of things at our fingertips. So we know when the police have perhaps used methods that are no way acceptable nowadays. But it also did give, police did have a little bit more opportunity to get some of these results, because they were a lot more feared and a lot more even respected, I would say, by people in general, but also sometimes the criminals as well. However, in this case, I think the methods used, we don't see them today for a very good reason. So the 4 suspects were subjected to a series of long, grueling and unbelievably harsh interrogations that are definitely unethical. The questioning sessions were relentless, stretching for hours on end with little to no respite. And Patrick Malloy was known to be a heavy drinker. He was actually the first to crack because he was interrogated alone for extended periods, and he was also subjected to physically aggressive, intimidating and unfair tactics as well. According to later reports, Malloy was shown a fabricated confession that was supposedly signed by Vincent Hickey, which implicated them all in the crime. And believing that his co-accused had already turned on him, Malloy made a statement saying he'd been inside Yew Tree Farm during the burglary, that he'd heard a gunshot from downstairs, and that admission was all the police needed to move forward. Whether it was the truth or not didn't seem to matter. When the police turned their attention to Vincent Hickey, Michael Hickey and James Robinson, they were all the more determined to extract those confessions from them as well. And the interrogations were every bit as brutal as Malloy's had been. They were denied sleep, questioned in isolation, and also subjected to psychological manipulation, telling them they were facing life in prison unless they cooperated, bombarded with questions, shouted at, and forced into contradictory statements. The pressure was immense, and by the time they were finished with Vincent Hickey, he too had allegedly confessed, although his statement, much like Malloy's, was absolutely riddled with inconsistencies. Michael Hickey was just 17. He was the youngest of the group, and he endured some of the harshest treatment. The officers played mind games with him, insisting that his friends had already admitted to everything and he was the last one holding out. They fabricated evidence, they threatened him with harsher sentences, and they even allegedly forged his signature on a confession statement when he refused to sign it himself.
Obviously, there's some really bad stuff there, and I'm not saying all of that goes on today, but it makes me wonder how much of this still goes on. So I certainly, there's a lot more regulation within the police, so I think it's probably impossible now to forge somebody's signature on a confession. But I do wonder about some of this psychological manipulation. Some of those tactics that were used, are they still used today? So if there is more than one person implicated, do police still use that sort of tool of, well, they've confessed now and they're blaming you, even though they've not done that, to get you into turning on them perhaps? I do wonder how much of that goes on, if at all. I might be totally wrong, it might not, but I could see that happening to this day.
I know, I do agree. And I think sometimes as well, it will be, well, he said this, she said that, he said this, she said that. And the police are allowed to do that, but it must really mess your mind up when you're already stressed in a difficult scenario.
This is where
This
is where I just know that I would crack under the pressure, because I would just believe everything they say. Everything they tell me, I'd believe it. So if you don't confess, you're gonna get this kind of sentence, or this person's turned on you, or they've said this, they said that. I would just take it all at face value and crack. So they would get me easily.
At least, though, nowadays you'd have a solicitor in there with you, able to say to you, they can't give you a life sentence for stealing a loaf of bread, Mark. Stop admitting to everything else.
Yeah.
Because you'd be sat there going, oh, also I kidnapped Shagar and I shot Dildando. You'd be literally confessing to everything, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Because the pressure is immense.
Yeah.
This always makes me think of Stephen Downing and how badly he was treated. And that was again in the 70s. That was 1973. He was convicted in 1974 of the murder of Wendy Sewell, and he hadn't done it, but he was in prison. You know, all these things that he confessed. He signed the confession. He couldn't read or write. Things like that. So yeah, it's just so frustrating here. Now, there was one member, James Robinson, who still faced all of the ruthless questioning, but he never confessed. He maintained his innocence throughout. It would be later used against him because police then said he was the ringleader. He was too smart to admit the truth. But he was the only one who did stick to his guns and really said, I was not there, I did not take part. Despite the glaring flaws in the confession, so contradictions, missing details, questionable integrity, a complete lack of forensic or physical evidence linking any of the group to the crime as well, the police treated their statements as indisputable proof. It was enough to secure charges, and before long, all 4 men were charged with murder. They were accused of one of the most shocking crimes in British history. They were protesting their innocence, but it was no use. The police had what they wanted, and in their eyes, they'd acted heroically. The case was all but closed. However, whilst the confession did technically place the gang at the crime scene, there were lots of questions that weren't answered. Who'd fired the gun? Why had he been shot? Why was Carl not just shooed away? If the burglars had been after money and valuables, why would they resort to murder? And Molloy didn't provide any clear answers. The police, convinced they finally had the resolution of their case, they weren't concerned about this myriad of inconsistencies. They were convinced beyond any doubt that they were on the right path. However, it was their eagerness and their desperation to secure convictions that would eventually be their undoing. The case was far from watertight, and in their relentless and shaky pursuit of justice, the police had overlooked one crucial problem. What if the men that they'd arrested were not responsible at all? The trial of Patrick Molloy, James Robinson, Michael Hickey and Vincent Hickey commenced in October 1979 at Stafford Crown Court, drawing significant public and media attention due to the brutal nature of Carl Bridgewater's murder and then also the subsequent arrest of those 4 defendants who the media had dubbed the Bridgewater Four. All 4 men faced charges related to the murder, and Robinson and Michael Hickey had also admitted to involvement in a separate armed robbery at Chapel Farm in Romsley. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Molloy's confession, at which he claimed to have been present at Yew Tree Farm during the burglary when he heard a gunshot from downstairs, and that confession implicated the other 3 defendants. Additionally, the prosecution presented witnesses who testified that the defendants had admitted in their involvement in the crime to them as well, and there was also a shotgun that Robinson had allegedly purchased for £20, which, despite zero forensic evidence to back the theory, the prosecution claimed was the murder weapon. Throughout the 5-week trial, the defence challenged the validity of Molloy's confession, arguing that it had been coerced out of him under duress and was unreliable, and Molloy himself declined to testify, but he did not retract his confession during the trial, and the defence also questioned the credibility of the witnesses, suggesting that their testimonies were inconsistent and lacked corroborative evidence. But despite all of these challenges, on November the 9th, 1979, the jury found Robinson, Michael Hickey and Vincent Hickey guilty of murder. And Patrick Molloy was convicted of manslaughter, presumably as a reward for his cooperation earlier on, or to be, to say that they didn't know, that where he was in the building or whatever the reason. So the sentences were pronounced on the 12th of November, 1979. Robinson and Vincent Hickey received life imprisonment with a recommended minimum term of 25 years. Michael Hickey, 18 at the time, was sentenced to be detained indefinitely at Her Majesty's pleasure, and Molloy was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The convictions were met with mixed reactions, because whilst some believed that justice had been served for the tragic death of that 13-year-old boy, others harboured doubts about the integrity of the investigation and the fairness of the trial. The convictions were secured. The so-called Bridgewater Four were behind bars, and so the police closed the case with a sense of finality. However, outside the walls of the courtroom, the uneasy whispers of doubt refused to die down. Those sentences were severe, life imprisonment and 12 years for Patrick Molloy, but Molloy would not serve even a fraction of that because he actually died just 2 years into his sentence. His death was quiet and unremarked upon at the time, but it left behind an enduring question. Had a vulnerable alcoholic been manipulated into confessing under duress, and had he then passed away in a prison cell, having been wrongly convicted of a child's murder? And those closest to the case were beginning to believe exactly that.
That's a horrible thought, isn't it? If he was an innocent man, then he was really vulnerable, a vulnerable alcoholic, and manipulated into confessing in prison for a crime that potentially he didn't commit, and then dies 2 years into that sentence, never having been exonerated if he should have been exonerated. That is a horrible thought.
It is, isn't it? And this confession, I mean, was it reliable or not? That was key. This was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, but even during the trial, he didn't make a direct admission to witnessing a murder, only that he'd supposedly been present during a robbery. He never gave testimony in court. His statement was coerced, his defence said. And after his death, the weight of this confession became even more difficult to ignore if it had been coerced out of him. And the families of the remaining 3 men refused to accept the verdicts. Michael Hickey's mother, Anne Whelan, became the most vocal and determined campaigner. She fought tirelessly to clear her son's name. She wrote letters, she lobbied MPs, and she spoke to anyone who would listen. Over the years, journalists, legal experts, and campaigners began to take notice. And what emerged from their efforts was deeply troubling. Serious questions about police conduct, the use of fabricated or uncorroborated evidence, and the credibility of the confessions. And it became increasingly clear that the case might not have been as solid as it had seemed in court. The truth about what had really happened in the police interview room and what hadn't was beginning to surface. And despite the heavy weight of their convictions, the 3 surviving members of the Bridgewater 4 never stopped fighting to clear their names. Their families took up the cause with unwavering determination, and what started as quiet doubt slowly evolved into a full-scale campaign for justice, one that would eventually expose the deep cracks in the original investigation. But of course, progress was incredibly slow. In 1989, after a decade behind bars, the first formal appeal was lodged. Hopes were high among campaigners that the appeal would lead to a breakthrough, but the judicial system was not ready to accept the possibility that a grievous error based on gross police malpractice had been made. The Court of Appeal rejected the case and left the 3 dejected men to return to their prison cells, and it left their supporters needing to regroup, ready to push forward. So it was another 8 years of continuing this uphill battle, gathering evidence and petitioning the Home Office and drawing the attention of investigative journalists before anything else happened. Now, one of the most pivotal figures in the fight for justice was a man called Paul Foote. He was a campaigning journalist with the Mirror, and he took an intense interest in the case. His investigation was so detailed that he unearthed a catalogue of errors, misconduct, and, most damning of all, evidence that had been fabricated and possibly even planted by police. It became increasingly impossible to ignore that this was not just a flawed case, it was an entirely broken one. And finally, on the 21st of February 1997, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Carl Bridgewater, the convictions were overturned. The Court of Appeal ruled that the original trial had been fundamentally unfair. And crucial to their decision was finding that key parts of the evidence had been fabricated by police officers in an attempt to coerce Patrick Malloy into confessing. And with Malloy long since deceased, his coerced statement revealed to be tainted, the entire foundation of the prosecution's case collapsed. And the judges did note that there might still have been enough circumstantial evidence to mount a fresh prosecution against Vincent Hickey, possibly on charges related to armed robbery, but the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, declined to pursue a retrial. And I guess, similar to what you just said there, Mark, these men are walking free, but they had lost nearly 20 years of their lives to a miscarriage of justice, and their vindication was bittersweet. And frustratingly, that's 20 years where evidence and investigations into the crime haven't been taking place. So that's 20 years of potentially lost eyewitnesses, evidence, or other, criminals who've then committed similar crimes that have not been looked at in relation to this case. It just across the board, this entire thing for them, the miscarriage of justice and being in prison for 20 years, but also for Carl Bridgewater's memory and finding who was responsible for his murder. Just nothing's happened then for 20 years.
And it's almost like the judges have put a stain on the characters of those 3 or 4, really, because posthumously Malloy is
Absolutely,
vindicated.
yeah.
And a stain is by those appeal judges, a stain, from what they've said, a stain is placed on their character by saying, well, there might still have been enough circumstantial evidence to mount a fresh
Only
prosecution.
against Vincent Hickey, though. So not against all four of them, against him. But you're right, his name isn't fully cleared, is it?
But then maybe he was responsible for, because wasn't there another armed robbery that he was convicted for?
And
so
I think,
maybe it related to that.
These four, I think I do think that they were doing other things. I definitely think that they were criminals, but just not murderers. I don't think, from my understanding of what they got up to. Shooting a firing shot above someone's head is horrific and terrifying for that person, but very different to shooting a child point blank in the head.
But also the thing is, and you alluded to this, it's because there's so much talk about the Bridgewater Four and their convictions being overturned all those years later. Carl Bridgewater is secondary in this case and is forgotten about. And up until this point, I don't know if anything happens post 1997 when these convictions are overturned. But yeah, it's almost at this point in time, you're sort of thinking, well, there's a 13-year-old boy who is the victim at the heart of this case, and his name isn't being mentioned as much as the 3 or 4 convicts who've had their convictions overturned. Yeah,
I know what you mean. I think for some people, his name is quite widely known, and for other people, the title, the Bridgewater Four, is what was in the media a lot more. We talk about this a lot, don't we? How frustrating that can be. And whilst obviously the surviving members of the Bridgewater Four and their families were really, overjoyed by this overturning of the murder convictions, there was fresh agony then for the loved ones of Carl Bridgewater, because, as I said, this is 20 years of his murder's not been investigated. If they didn't do this, who was responsible? Preparations were also made to bring charges against 4 Staffordshire police officers for fabricating evidence, but in December 1998, that case was quietly dropped. So even in the face of one of the most notorious wrongful convictions in British legal history, accountability for those investigators never came, and I find that very, very frustrating. So the investigation into Carl's murder was reopened, but predictably, not much was achieved in the way of progress. Detectives did briefly identify a new suspect. The evidence against him was purely circumstantial, but it was compelling enough to warrant a closer look. It later transpired that this individual had been a suspect since day one of the investigation, but because the police were so hell-bent on nailing the Bridgewater Four, they'd essentially dropped him from the case altogether, and his name was Bert Spencer. He was born in 1939, and Bert Spencer was a local man from Wordsley, so the same neighbourhood where Carl Bridgewater lived, and in fact he lived just 5 houses down from the Bridgewater family. He was a uniformed ambulance driver working at Corbett Hospital in Stourbridge, and he was known around the town as respectable and well-dressed. He wasn't someone who'd immediately arouse suspicion. But there were several facts about his life and his behaviour that raised red flags in the days following Carl's murder. Not only did he hold a shotgun licence, but Spencer was also known to shoot regularly at Yew Tree Farm, the very property where Carl was killed, and on the day of the murder, witnesses reported seeing a blue Vauxhall Viva parked near the farm, and that was what Spencer drove. What's more, the driver was described as being in uniform, so that kind of placed him close to the scene of the crime, both geographically but also circumstantially. Despite this, he was eliminated from the investigation early on, and that was primarily because the police thought they had their men. But their suspicions surrounding Bert Spencer never entirely disappeared. And that was particularly after something that happened the following year. In December 1979, at a party celebrating his 40th birthday, Bert Spencer shot and killed 70-year-old Hubert Wilkes, a friend and neighbour. Much like Carl, Wilkes was shot while sitting on a sofa. Now, Spencer admitted to the killing, but claimed it was manslaughter, not murder. And so he had admitted to this, but, he was convicted and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, and he served 15 years before he was released on parole in 1995. The similarity in the two cases, cold, calm, and domestic, added a chilling undertone to lingering theories about his possible involvement in Carl's murder. Bert Spencer's name resurfaced in 2016 when true crime author Simon W. Golding published Scapegoat for Murder, The Truth About the Killing of Carl Bridgewater. And in conjunction with the book, Channel 4 aired a television documentary titled Interview with a Murderer. So in that show, criminologist Professor David Wilson, who we both absolutely love, sat down with Spencer for a probing series of interviews. And during the programme, disturbing revelations began to surface. Bert Spencer's own daughter admitted she believed that her dad had been at Yew Tree Farm on the day that Carl was murdered and possibly had seen something. An ambulance station secretary, originally thought to have given Bert Spencer an alibi, conceded on camera that she couldn't be certain that he hadn't left work during his shift. And perhaps most damning of all was Professor Wilson's psychological assessment of Spencer. He used a P-scan personality test and concluded that Bert Spencer displayed traits consistent with a manipulative and callous psychopath. And he even confronted Spencer during their final meeting, accusing him of hiding behind a, quote, kindly old grandfather shtick. Now, Spencer did not deny disposing of his shotgun the day after Carl's murder, something that his former wife had confirmed, and that revelation, she thought, might trigger renewed police interest in the case. But in March 2017, after reviewing the allegations presented in the documentary, police confirmed that they would not be taking any further action against Bert Spencer. He has never been charged with Carl's murder, and to this day, he still maintains his innocence.
I mean, I know there's a little bit more to this that you'll come on to, but fair play to David Wilson for, he is a legend, isn't he, for confronting him and saying, you're lying, and I've got all these people that are saying you did this or they don't believe you. And yeah, I just love the balls that he's got to confront him and say, yeah, you're just hiding behind this old grandfather nonsense.
He always reminds me a little bit, David Wilson, of, who's the guy, what's his name? Louis Theroux, where he will just ask some really blunt questions or some kind of things that other people won't ask of his interviewees. I know they do very different jobs, but he sometimes reminds me of him because he will just come out and be like, well, did you do that? Or do you do that? And you can see the celebrities a bit like, whoa, okay, someone's actually going to be blunt with me.
I think it's those awkward questions and that confrontation that 99% of us avoid in our day-to-day lives. So when you see it for real, it's like, whoa, it feels uncomfortable to watch, but actually you want to know how this person is going to react to being confronted in that way. So it's really interesting to see.
In 2024, Bert Spencer re-entered the spotlight again, and this time he actually initiated legal proceedings against Simon W. Golding, claiming that Scapegoat for Murder was plagiarised from manuscripts that he'd written whilst he was in prison in the 1990s, and Golding publicly refuted the claim, stating, "I'll go to prison before I send him a penny." So, whilst he's never been officially indicted, Bert Spencer remains the most prominent alternative suspect in this kind of enduring unsolved child murder. His presence looms over the case not just because of what he might have done, but because of what may have been overlooked in the rush to convict 4 innocent men. If Bert Spencer had all these, bits of circumstantial evidence against him, who else did the police not look at properly?
And also, it's so, if it's not Bert Spencer, then there's huge coincidences here. He's seen on the farm. That's pretty good eyewitness testimony that his car's there and a man in uniform in that car. He gets rid of his shotgun the next day. The following year, he murders somebody in a similar setup. He lived 5 doors down from Carl Bridgewater and his family. So there's a lot of coincidences here that we need to just swallow if we're to accept that it wasn't him. So, yeah, there is understandably a lot of suspicion still on him.
Yeah, and for me with this case, he is, for me, the most likely suspect. I always have this idea that he wasn't supposed to be there. He was potentially taking items and stealing from this couple, the cousins, who you made me call them a couple now. That he was, potentially robbing them. He knew that they weren't there because he would quite often go and shoot on their land. And then Carl knows him. He lives 5 doors down. So there's no way you're going to get away with this robbery. Carl will tell them. You've got to
take out the witness. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's always been my gut feeling with this. However, I have to, in the interest of fairness to Bert Spencer, the police specifically chose not to go down that route. There must be a reason. What that reason is, I do not know. But yeah, it's always been a real difficult point for me that, as we've said, the Bridgewater Four were just so hard focused on. The police didn't look elsewhere, and that is not fair for Carl and his loved ones.
It's not, but the reason the police could have focused on them to the detriment of pursuing the real suspect in this case, the reason the police might have focused on them is because they were troublemakers. There were 4 individuals who were involved in robberies, and they wanted to just put them away so that it was less shit going on their patch. So their life would be easier if they were all behind bars. So let's pin this on them, and we can take them out of the equation now and focus on real police work or catching other criminals. We don't need to waste our time on these reprobates.
Do you want something else that will make you really mad as well with this case? Just a little fact for you. The Court of Appeal ruled that both of the Hickey cousins had to lose a quarter of their loss of earnings compensation on the basis that they had been receiving free food and accommodation in prison. So they'd been wrongfully imprisoned for about 18 years and then were told, because you were having free food and accommodation, you're actually going to lose a quarter of your loss of earnings compensation. Isn't that just...
That is normal. Look at Barry George. He didn't get any compensation for his wrongful conviction.
It makes us mad every time,
of the murder
don't
of
we?
Jill Dando. Yeah. And it was a I mean, with that, the police said, well, we still think he did it. No respect to the court system at all. Quite happy to respect the court when they convicted him originally, but not when they overturned that conviction. And yeah, no compensation. And we see it time and again that they say, well, you've had free food and board. So, we're going to make a deduction or not award anything. It's just ridiculous.
It's become one of those notorious miscarriages of justice cases in British legal history. And although 3 of them were eventually freed, they left prison as broken men. They were older, they were traumatised, they were burdened by the years that had been stolen from them. And Patrick Malloy had died never seeing those convictions overturned, knowing he'd confessed to something under unbearable pressure that he hadn't done. And the appeal that cleared their names just came too late. Yes, the ruling in 1997 exposed police misconduct, but no one's ever been held accountable for those failures. And for the families of the wrongly convicted, the overturning of the verdicts was victory, but it wasn't justice. It wasn't full. It wasn't everything. It was, yes, we've won, but at what cost? And for the Bridgewater family, it was no closure at all because Carl's murder remains unsolved. This was a boy who was loved, who was kind, who was hardworking, who was full of potential. He was taken from his family in a senseless act of violence, and nobody, not the Bridgewater Four, not Bert Spencer, not anybody else, has officially now been held to account. His parents, his siblings and his friends were left with not only grief, but decades of confusion, frustration and unanswered questions.
Always is sad, but when it's effectively unsolved, which this is unsolved, that there is, that real lack of closure for those left behind.
It's horrible, isn't it? Yeah. Really, really sad.
What a horrible start to season 14.
So many of our listeners, what a horrible start. I mean, so many of our listeners have referenced this case. We've talked, I'm sure I've mentioned Carl, and I know I've definitely spoken to some of our listeners. So there will be more people than just Aaron who've asked us to cover this, because these miscarriages of justice, they just really upset you, don't they? They just make you feel just so disheartened and upset with the judicial system. And the fact that none of those officers then were actually charged with anything really upset me and frustrates me.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening, everybody. And I was about to say welcome myself back, which is a ridiculous thing to say, but I'm very excited to be back, I think is what I was meaning. And it's been really nice to get back into writing some scripts and getting things prepped again. It's going to be a little bit tricky. Anybody who's got little ones will know what it's like when you've got a baby that wants to be with you all the time and you need some time away to go and do some work. So always fun. But Mark, thank you for stepping up again, and thank you for your support of me, making sure that I was able to come back and do this, because I love doing the show. And thank you to everybody who listens. for tuning in again.
And we'll be back next week with another case, so we will see you for that.
We will. See you then. Bye.
You've seen the screams, the traps, the twists, but do you know the stories behind them? The little details that make you go,
This is the most fuckery thing I've ever seen.
or, yeah, I saw my own leg off, but shitty toilet, I'm out. I'm Grace from Red Rum True Crime, and I'm joined by Stu from British Murders with Stuart Blues. We've been horror fans since we were kids, and we are total Saw geeks. This franchise is iconic for a reason, and we cannot wait to talk every crazy twist, every insane trap, and all the behind-the-scenes tidbits you probably didn't notice. This first season is 10 episodes, breaking down, analysing, and dissecting every single one of the Saw films. And the final cut doesn't stop there. Every season, I'll pick a different horror franchise with a new guest co-host to geek out over, dissect, and celebrate everything that makes these films unforgettable. We talk traps, legacy, and philosophy. I'm Grace, and this is The Final Cut. Find us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.